For 1,000 years, Sweden has stood like a quiet northern giant, cold winds outside, blazing ambition inside. From Viking warriors steering dragon-headed ships through roaring seas, to a tiny frozen kingdom rising into one of the richest, safest, and most admired nations on Earth, Sweden's history is a story the world often forgets, but never should. Behind every peaceful Swedish meadow lies a battlefield. Behind every innovation lies centuries of struggle, survival, and unbelievable transformation. This is not just history. This is a journey through time, war, culture, and human willpower. If you love your country, subscribe. If you love your mother, comment below. Sweden's historical roots reach so far back that even the land seems older than memory itself. Before it became a modern powerhouse of technology, peace, and prosperity, it was a rugged wilderness carved by glaciers, shaped by storms, and ruled by tribes who fought nature and each other to survive. The earliest Swedes lived in a world where winter could swallow entire settlements, where the forests were thick and unforgiving, and where survival depended on strength, cooperation, and an unbreakable spirit. These ancient people did not build empires, not yet, but they built something far more important: resilience. As time passed, small tribal groups emerged, scattered across the Swedish landscape. These tribes were hunters, gatherers, fishers, and eventually farmers who slowly learned to tame the harsh environment. While the world was changing, Rome rising and falling, empires expanding and collapsing, Sweden was quietly preparing for its own destiny. It waited in silence, like a sleeping bear in winter, gathering its strength for a storm that would one day carry its name across oceans. That storm arrived with the Vikings. The Vikings of Sweden were not merely raiders. They were explorers, traders, diplomats, and master navigators. While Norway's Vikings sailed west toward Iceland, Greenland, and America, and Denmark's Vikings terrorized England and France, the Swedish Vikings carved an entirely different path, eastward. Their ships cut through the cold rivers of Russia, down to the Black Sea, to Byzantium, and even into the heart of the Arab world. They brought fur, iron, and amber, and returned with gold, silk, and stories of distant lands. But the Vikings were more than travelers. They were nation builders. Out of loose tribes, they planted the seeds of the Swedish state, forming alliances, constructing settlements, and shaping the identity of a people who would one day stand among the most educated and prosperous in human history. By the Middle Ages, Sweden began to transform. Kings emerged, not in full control, but influential enough to begin binding the country together. Castles rose, laws were written, and Christianity slowly replaced the old Norse gods. The shift wasn't smooth. There were rebellions, power struggles, and long periods of fragmentation where one region fought another, each seeking dominance. But unity, though fragile, grew over time. Sweden's destiny changed completely when it joined the Kalmar Union in 1397, a political alliance linking Sweden, Denmark, and Norway under one monarch. But this union was built on shaky ground. Denmark tried to dominate, and Sweden refused to bow. Tension grew until it erupted in one of the darkest episodes in Scandinavian history, the Stockholm bloodbath of 1520. When Danish forces executed around 80 Swedish nobles in the capital, Sweden's fury exploded. From this chaos emerged a national hero, Gustav Vasa. He sparked a rebellion, broke Sweden free from Danish control, and established a new monarchy that would transform the nation. His reign marked the beginning of modern Sweden, a country driven by ambition, discipline, and a surprising hunger for power. Over the next century, Sweden rose like a northern storm. It built one of the most feared military forces in Europe, forging an empire that stretched across the Baltic Sea. Under the leadership of brilliant kings like Gustavus Adolphus, Sweden became a major player in the 30 Years' War, reshaping the balance of power across Europe. Its armies marched through Germany with astonishing speed and precision, earning the nation a reputation for strength far beyond its size. But empires built by fire often end in fire. By the early 18th century, Sweden's empire began to crumble. The Great Northern War, fought against Russia and other European powers, drained Sweden's resources and shattered its military dominance. The young warrior King Charles XII led Sweden with almost supernatural bravery. but his relentless ambition pushed the nation beyond its limits. When he died in battle, so too did Sweden's age of conquest. Yet instead of collapsing, Sweden transformed again. It reinvented itself, not as a military empire, but as a nation of innovation, culture, and diplomacy. The 18th and 19th centuries brought major reforms: parliaments, civil rights, economic modernization, scientific breakthroughs, and cultural development. Sweden shifted from battlefield glory to intellectual and social progress, becoming a land where thinkers, engineers, and reformers replaced warriors. Then came industrialization. Sweden, rich in natural resources like timber and iron ore, rapidly grew into an economic powerhouse. Companies like Ericsson, Volvo, IKEA, and later Spotify would carry Swedish creativity and engineering to every corner of the world. Poverty faded, education expanded, and living standards climbed. Sweden's greatest transformation, however, began in the 20th century. While Europe burned in 2 world wars, Sweden chose neutrality, preserving its resources and focusing on internal development. After World War II, it built one of the strongest welfare states in history, offering universal healthcare, free education, and wide-ranging social protection. The world watched as Sweden became a model for equality, economic stability, and quality of life. But even success brought challenges: immigration issues, debates over national identity, economic pressures, and political shifts. Still, Sweden remains a nation that adapts, learns, and grows, just as it has for thousands of years. Today, Sweden stands as a global leader in innovation, sustainability, human development, and peace. Its journey, from ancient tribes to Viking explorers, from bloody struggles to modern prosperity, is one of the most remarkable transformations in world history. And that journey continues. Why do some nations rise from hardship while others fall? What makes Sweden's transformation so extraordinary? Subscribe now, and if you love your mother, comment below. Sweden is more than a country. It is a living story, one written in ice, iron, courage, and human imagination. When people today think of Sweden, they imagine peaceful towns, clean cities, beautiful landscapes, cutting-edge technology, and a society that seems to run like a perfectly tuned machine. But behind this modern image lies a long, powerful, and often dramatic history. Sweden's past is not gentle. It is full of wars, rebellions, hunger, ambition, exploration, sacrifice, and reinvention. Understanding Sweden means looking beyond its reputation. It means going deep into the centuries that shaped it, into the forests where ancient tribes survived brutal winters into the longboats, where Vikings crossed seas into the castles, where kings planned wars into the fields, where farmers struggled into the factories, where industry rose, and into the modern cities where innovation now thrives. This documentary begins where history itself whispers, far before Sweden became a nation. At the end of the Ice Age, when glaciers retreated and humans first set foot on Swedish soil, the land was raw, silent, and waiting. People settled, built communities, and adapted to the extreme climate. Though their stories are lost in time, their spirit shaped the Swedish character, hardworking, resilient, and resourceful. As centuries passed, these settlements grew into tribes with their own cultures and ways of life. Sweden was not a united land. It was a mosaic of groups who fought the elements and sometimes each other. But even then, the seeds of unity were being planted. The people developed shared traditions, common languages, and systems of cooperation that would later help them form a nation. The Viking Age marked the first great turning point. Sweden's Vikings, known as the Varangians, didn't just raid. They explored, traded, negotiated, and established connections across continents. They traveled through the rivers of Eastern Europe, influencing regions that would later become Russia and Ukraine. They served as elite guards for the Byzantine emperors. Their courage, intelligence, and skill laid the foundation for Sweden's future influence. Yet even as the Vikings expanded outward, change was stirring at home. Christianity began replacing the Old Norse religion, bringing new ideas, new conflicts, and new power structures. The Middle Ages turned Sweden into a land of kings, laws, churches, and growing national consciousness. It was not always stable. Nobles fought for power, peasants demanded rights, and foreign threats loomed. But the idea of Sweden as a nation was taking shape. By the 1500s, After centuries of tension, the country reached a breaking point under the Kalmar Union. Denmark's attempt to dominate Sweden resulted in bloodshed and outrage. In response, Gustav Vasa rose as a leader who freed Sweden and redefined its destiny. He centralized power, modernized the state, and laid the foundation for the Swedish monarchy that continues to this day. The 1600s brought Sweden's second major transformation, its rise as a European great power. With disciplined armies, strategic leadership, and relentless ambition, Sweden built an empire across the Baltic. For a time, it punched far above its size, becoming one of Europe's strongest military forces. But like all empires driven by war, it eventually overstretched. The Great Northern War broke Sweden's dominance, and the nation had to face a new reality. Instead of collapsing, Sweden evolved. It embraced science, education, and political reform. The Age of Liberty introduced parliamentary rule. Thinkers, inventors, and reformers reshaped society. In the 19th century, industrialization brought massive economic change, turning Sweden from a poor rural society into a modern industrial nation. The 20th century transformed Sweden once again, this time into a global model of welfare, equality, and social development. Neutral during world wars, stable during global crises, Sweden built a system that ensured prosperity and security for most of its people. It became known for innovation, diplomacy, and humanitarian work. And yet, Sweden never stopped changing. Today it faces new challenges: migration, economic competition, political divides, but also new opportunities in technology, environmental leadership, and global cooperation. Through all of this, Sweden remains one of the world's most admired nations, not because it is perfect, but because it constantly adapts, improves, and reinvents itself. This documentary is your journey through that powerful transformation, a journey across centuries of struggle and achievement, guided by a story that continues to inspire the world. Sweden's history begins in a place where memory dissolves into myth, where the forests were so dense that sunlight struggled to touch the ground, and where frozen winds howled across untouched snowfields long before a single kingdom was imagined. When we speak of Sweden today, we picture modern cities, calm societies, and quiet order. But beneath that calm lies a mystery spanning thousands of years, a riddle carved by ice, guarded by forests, and whispered through ancient sagas. This land, cold, remote, and unforgiving, should have been impossible to tame. Yet it became home to one of the world's most resilient civilizations. How? That is the mystery at the heart of Sweden's origin. The story begins long before kings, before Christianity, before runestones, back when the land itself was still being shaped by the retreating glaciers of the Ice Age. When the ice pulled away nearly 12,000 years ago, Sweden was a raw wilderness. Giant boulders left behind by glaciers stood like silent guardians. The air was crisp, the lakes were newborn, and the forests slowly emerged from frozen soil. It was into this silent world that the first humans stepped, small groups of hunter-gatherers who ventured north, chasing the promise of untouched land. What made them come? We can only guess. Perhaps they followed migrating animals. Perhaps they fled conflict in the south. Or perhaps the lure of the unknown pulled them forward. Whatever the reason, their arrival planted the first seeds of what would become Swedish identity: courage, exploration, and stubborn endurance. Archaeologists still find traces of these early settlers: stone tools, fire remains, bone fragments. Each one a clue pointing to a people who survived without kingdoms, without written language, and without certainty. They lived close to nature, reading the seasons like a book, trusting in instincts sharpened by hardship. But their greatest legacy was not physical. It was psychological. They built the foundation of a character that would echo across Swedish history: quiet determination. Even today, Swedes call it sisu, lagom, or simply resilience. It began here, in the struggle to survive in a land that offered nothing for free. Time passed. Centuries folded into millennia. Tribes formed and spread. Cultures emerged, disappeared, and evolved. The land remained harsh, yet humans adapted with remarkable skill. But somewhere amid these early centuries lies a secret, one of the most debated mysteries in Scandinavian history. Who were the first true ancestors of the Swedish people? Different theories rise and fall. Genetic evidence links ancient Swedes to nomadic hunter groups from Eastern Europe. Other research suggests influence from early farmers migrating from the Middle East. But the truth is still blurry, as if hidden behind a veil the past refuses to lift. Whatever their origins, these groups blended over time, forming the early Nordic peoples, tough, resourceful, and deeply connected to the land. As the Stone Age turned into the Bronze Age, Sweden experienced another mysterious transformation. Suddenly, its people began producing weaponry, jewelry, tools, and carvings of astonishing detail. Bronze was not local to Sweden, so where did it come from? That question opens another layer of mystery. Trade routes must have existed, stretching across vast distances, perhaps reaching as far as the Mediterranean. Sweden, remote as it was, clearly wasn't isolated. Something in its people compelled them to reach outward. Stone carvings from this era, ships, warriors, rituals, suggest a society rich in symbolism. They hint at beliefs centered on the sun, death, and the sea. But the deeper meaning remains locked away because the people left no written records. Their religion, laws, myths, and daily lives exist only through silent clues carved into granite thousands of years ago. Then, somewhere between the Bronze and Iron Ages, the Swedish character sharpened once again. Weapons became deadlier. Burial mounds expanded. Power concentrated. What had once been scattered tribes began evolving into early chiefdoms. The seeds of centralized authority were planted, and with them, a rising tension that would eventually shake all of Europe. No mystery in Sweden's early history is as captivating as the question of how these tribes transformed into the Viking civilization. Scandinavian society didn't suddenly wake up one morning and become Viking. The process was slow, subtle, and still not fully understood. But one thing is clear: something in the Nordic world ignited. Perhaps it was population pressure. Perhaps it was advances in shipbuilding. Perhaps it was conflict, ambition, or simple curiosity. Whatever the spark, it lit a fire that produced one of history's most legendary cultures. The Swedish Vikings were different from their Danish and Norwegian counterparts. While Norway pushed west across the Atlantic and Denmark targeted England and France, the Swedes turned east, down rivers that sliced through Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. They traded furs, iron, and slaves. They returned with silver, silk, and exotic goods from the Islamic world. These expeditions were so frequent and powerful that foreign records identified them with a special name: the Rus. Some historians believe these Swedish Vikings helped shape the early Russian state. Others argue they simply influenced local tribes. The debate burns fiercely even today. But the mystery remains: how far did Swedish impact reach? What we know is that Swedish Vikings weren't merely raiders. They were political negotiators, explorers, and economic architects. Their ships, carved like dragons, carried not just warriors, but ideas that spread across continents. This eastern expansion remains one of history's most intriguing enigmas because it rewrites our assumptions about European development. Yet, even as Swedish Vikings sailed into distant empires, back home, something else was happening, something just as mysterious. Power was shifting. Tribal leaders were merging into regional kings. The old pagan religion was clashing with the rising tide of Christianity. Brutal sacrifices took place at temples like Gamla Uppsala, while Christian missionaries preached new truths. These opposing worlds existed side by side for centuries, creating a cultural tension that shaped Sweden's identity. Why did Sweden convert so late compared to the rest of Europe? Why did pagan traditions remain strong even into the Middle Ages? Historians still debate these questions. Conversion wasn't a single moment. It was a slow, uneven process filled with conflict, negotiation, and political strategy. Sweden's greatest mysteries aren't just archaeological, they're psychological. Through all these eras, one question threads through history: how did a people from such a remote, harsh land develop such extraordinary influence? How did they build trade routes across continents, shape political structures far beyond Scandinavia, and lay the groundwork for a kingdom that would one day become a European great power? And perhaps the most puzzling mystery of all: how did this once cold wilderness transform into a modern paradise admired by the world? This is where Sweden's story pulls us deeper. Every clue, carved stone, buried sword, ancient rumor, points to a civilization always in motion. a civilization shaped not by chance, but by choices made in the shadows of forests and the silence of frozen lakes. Sweden's mystery is not a single event. It is a 1,000-year transformation, a quiet evolution that the world barely noticed, until Sweden suddenly emerged as a force no one could ignore. And now, with the Vikings rising, old gods fading, and kingdoms forming, the mystery only grows darker. Every great civilization carries a shadow, a hidden trail of unanswered questions, political twists, and silent betrayals that shape its destiny. Sweden, calm and orderly today, was once a battleground not just of armies, but of suspicions buried so deep they shaped the fate of kings, priests, warriors, and ordinary families across the land. The Viking Age had brought wealth, reputation, and influence, but it also brought something far more dangerous: ambition. When power grows, trust dies. And as Sweden marched toward becoming a unified kingdom, suspicion became the silent architect of its future. At the heart of Sweden's story lies a question historians still whisper: was Sweden truly united, or forced into unity by fear? Long before the modern state, Sweden was divided into regions: Svealand, Gotaland, and Norrland, each with its own leaders, armies, and loyalties. These groups did not always trust one another. The Svea believed they were destined to rule. The Goter claimed equal honor. Traders suspected warriors. Pagans suspected Christians. Even within families, brothers suspected brothers, fearing betrayal over land, wealth, or power. As Christianity spread across Europe, Swedish leaders watched, waited, and wondered: should they convert? Should they resist? Accepting Christianity meant new political alliances with powerful European kingdoms. But rejecting it maintained ancient traditions and the authority of pagan priests. This tension was not a peaceful debate. It was a cold war. Priests suspected kings. Kings suspected nobles. Everyone suspected the missionaries who claimed to save souls, but might be agents of foreign influence. Gamla Uppsala, once the spiritual heart of pagan Sweden, became the center of this silent conflict. Temples stood tall, sacrifices continued, and the old gods, Thor, Odin, Freyr, remained powerful symbols of identity. But beneath the rituals lay fear. Each festival could be the last. Each ceremony could trigger rebellion. A single wrong decision could bring civil war. Suspicion poisoned trust between clans. One region might secretly negotiate with Christian rulers abroad. Another might form alliances with rival Swedish chiefs. And as these hidden networks grew, the people began to sense something darker moving beneath the surface. A shift so subtle, yet so powerful that it threatened to tear the land apart. Then came the rise of the early kings, figures surrounded by legends, half fact and half myth. Some historians argue that Sweden's first kings were not noble rulers, but ambitious warlords presenting themselves as chosen by gods. Others claim they were elected leaders who gained power through charisma and negotiation. But even this remains locked in suspicion because written records were scarce. What we do know is this: as kings gained power, their enemies multiplied. Every decision was watched. Every alliance questioned. Every victory produced whispers in the shadows. The Viking expeditions, which once symbolized adventure and prosperity, also became sources of political doubt. A successful raid enriched warriors, but made kings nervous. What if a wealthy war leader used his fame to challenge the throne? What if foreign silver funded rebellion at home? What if loyalty shifted from crown to captain? Suspicion seeped into Sweden's growing ties with the East. The Varangian Guard, a feared elite unit in Byzantium, contained many Swedish warriors. But when these warriors returned home with gold, knowledge, and military experience, they were not always welcomed. Kings questioned their intentions. Nobles feared their influence. Foreign exposure made them unpredictable. Even the runestones scattered across Sweden, silent messages carved in stone, contain hints of political tension. Some honor fallen warriors. Others mark land disputes. A few hint at betrayals or sudden deaths. And many were erected by powerful families trying to assert dominance over rivals. As the medieval era approached, the stakes rose. Sweden's path towards centralized power was accelerating, and with it came deeper suspicion. Noble families watched one another with icy caution. Whoever controlled the king controlled the nation. Whoever controlled the church controlled the king. And whoever controlled trade routes controlled wealth. One misstep could mean exile or execution. When Sweden finally embraced Christianity, suspicion didn't fade, it grew sharper. Old families who once held power over pagan rituals lost their influence. Priests gained authority. Foreign bishops entered the political arena. The church took land, wealth, and power. Many nobles felt threatened. Some resisted openly. Others resisted in silence. Even the peasantry, usually seen as passive, held suspicions. They feared that new laws would break ancient traditions. They worried that foreign customs would erase their identity. And they watched their rulers closely, ready to resist if they sensed betrayal. What makes this era so fascinating is that Sweden's transformation wasn't built on stability. It was built on unease. Cooperation came not from trust, but from mutual fear of what lay beyond the borders. Denmark and Norway were rising powers. The German states grew stronger. The Baltic world was filled with traders, pirates, and warlords. Every nation wanted influence in Scandinavia. To survive, Sweden had no choice but to unify, not out of love, but out of suspicion. It is this quiet, relentless tension that shaped early Sweden's political DNA. Even today, Swedish society's emphasis on transparency, fairness, and equality can be traced back to these turbulent centuries, an attempt to build systems that reduce suspicion, because suspicion nearly destroyed the country before it was fully born. Sweden learned early that whispered wars are more dangerous than open battles. Betrayal cuts deeper than swords, and secrecy can unmake nations long before foreign armies ever arrive. The story now moves toward the moment when all hidden tensions explode, when suspicion transforms into open conflict, when kings fall, alliances break, and Sweden faces the storm that will define its destiny. Because every mystery leads to suspicion, and every suspicion leads to a climax.